Good evening.
Good evening.
So, we want to do our devotion again today.
Okay.
From the same book, Storytime in Africa, Book 1. And today, our devotion is titled From Sunday to Sabbath. Say From Sunday to Sabbath.
From Sunday to Sabbath.
Our key text is coming from the book of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 1. Say Matthew 28, verse 1.
Matthew 28, verse 1.
Matthew 28, verse 1.
Matthew 28, verse 1.
And this is what the Bible says. After the Sabbath, as Sunday morning was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the grave. After the Sabbath, as Sunday morning was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the grave. Let's read the story and hear what the story says. Remember, the topic of the story was from Sunday to Sabbath. One day, Pastor Ruben Yeri visited a church where people meet on Sunday. He had been invited there by a good friend. When he arrived at the church, the people talked with him. "So you are a pastor," they said. "Please preach today." So he preached that day, and the church elder translated for him. His sermon was about the Sabbath. It was a rather strange sermon for these people, but he preached it anyway. Now, the translator did not believe what Pastor Yeri was saying. Every time the preacher said Sabbath, the translator would say Sunday. But after church, some of the people talked together. Some of them knew well the language in which the pastor was speaking. Why did the translator alter his sermon? They wondered. The translator went home. Then Monday morning, he said to himself, "The preacher said Sabbath. I translated it to mean Sunday. I wonder what the real truth is." He took his Bible and began to read some of the texts the preacher had used. He turned to Daniel 7, verse 25, where it talks about someone who will change God's laws. Then he read Matthew 28, verse 1, where it mentions the first day of the week. He found Luke 23, 54 to 56, and read that too. Surely, someone must have changed the Sabbath to Sunday. But he did wrong when he changed it. Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. I did not know that before, he said to himself. All day Tuesday he studied. Wednesday he decided that he would preach the same sermon next Sunday. He would tell it the way the preacher had preached it. He would tell it the way the preacher had preached it the week before. If these people hear it straight, I'm sure they will believe it. He prayed for a long time on Wednesday. Thursday came. That day, he prepared his sermon. It would be the same sermon the pastor had preached, but still he was afraid. What would the people say? That night, he had a dream. "You should preach it," the voice said. 3 times he heard that voice. Then he woke up. "I will surely preach it," he said. He could not sleep anymore that night. He had much to think about. Sunday morning came. The elder went to his church. He preached the sermon. Then he asked for all who wanted to keep the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week to stand up. Half of the people stood up. That afternoon, the old men came to a meeting to talk about the sermon. They talked about the Sabbath and how to keep it. "We as elders must agree and then tell the members," they said, so they all agreed. The next Sunday, they talked about it again. Some of the people had not been there before. This time, 3/4 of the 325 members said they would keep the Sabbath. "When shall we start keeping the Sabbath?" asked the people. "We must start next Sabbath," the elders said. That week, they wrote to Pastor Ruben and asked him to come to see them. When he arrived, they told him all that had happened. "Please tell us how to keep the Sabbath," they said. So the pastor preached to the people, and that day, the whole church agreed to keep the Sabbath. Not many days later, they wrote a letter to their church leaders to tell them what they had decided. They said, "We want to obey all that God has told us." They also wrote to the Sabbath-keeping church to tell them what they had decided. This is the story of how a whole church decided to keep the Sabbath. 1 month later, there was a large baptism. 6 pastors came to baptize the many people. Today, if you go to Molo in Kenya, you will find about 560 members in the church, for God has blessed them. The story is told by Jairus Mkwana, an evangelist in Kenya. What have you learned from the story?
We learned that we should always serve God on Saturday.
All right, but should we just have God on Sabbath only?
No, every day
What happened to these people? When were they going to church?
on Sunday.
And then what happened? And they changed and started doing Sabbath?
The pastor talked to them and they understood what he said.
All right, thank you. Do you like my story?
Yes, we
We like your story.
Come on,
Yes,
read that.
we do. So don't forget to come again.
To come again.
Oh yes, to tell us more. That is so beautiful. So, and that is the end of our story. See you tomorrow again. Bye.
Mom.